Okay, I think we can get started as we have quite a packed agenda today. Welcome to everybody who is coming in. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon. We're really glad to see so many people have registered and so many people are joining. We are also recording this webinar, so any colleagues or friends of yours who couldn't make it for whatever reason will have the opportunity to watch it afterwards. My name is Dilwyn Fisher. I work for Oil Change International, or OCI. I'm based in Oslo, Norway, where I work on our North Sea team, and I work against what we consider to be false solutions to the climate crisis. And that's what this webinar is about today, pulling back the curtain, taking on false solutions. And the idea here is that we've assembled the Avengers of taking on false solution, or a rogues gallery, I suppose, from the oil and gas industry's point of view. Of people who are working on these issues. And the point of the webinar is simply to give you all a kind of very quick introduction to some of the false solutions that are undermining climate policy in Europe in particular, but this will be relevant wherever you are in the globe, or even in the UK, I was going to say, which I suppose formally still is a part of Europe, but not the EU. And give you all a kind of introduction to some of the issues that we're working on and why we're working on them. Very quickly, before I introduce the panelists, just to give a quick introduction to what is Real Zero Europe, or RZE. RZE is a campaign calling on the EU to deliver real emissions reductions and real solutions to the climate crisis instead of corporate greenwash net zero targets. And obviously, it's up for interpretation what those real solutions are, but what we try and do at least is unite around what the false solutions are, and that's what we'll be giving you a little taste of today. So RZE is a network of organizations. OCI is a member. The other people here today and their organizations are members. Organizations can join, and as long as they agree to our statement, they can be a member. And we do things like organizing webinars, spreading information, meeting and discussing policy, and how we can fight back against the kind of corporate greenwash net zero targets that we're seeing, not just at EU level, but across different countries as well. So if that's something that's interesting for you, or you want to learn more, please do go to www.realzeroeurope.org, or you can ask one of us today. That's no problem at all. But that's why we're putting on this webinar. This webinar is the first in what we hope will be a series of deeper dives into the false solutions that are undermining the EU's and European countries' climate agenda. So do look out for more of those webinars coming soon. But as I said, today we have brought together a big team of people who are going to give you a quick introduction to things. Just very quickly, house rules. I'm sure all of you by now have seen this before, but just in case you haven't, there is a Q&A function where you can ask questions to the speakers, and this webinar will be recorded and made available online afterwards. And the format will be that each speaker is going to give a kind of 15-minute introduction to their topic, and then there'll be time to ask questions directly afterwards. And then hopefully at the end of the session, we will have time for broader discussion, Q&A. So please write your questions into the Q&A tab whenever you get a chance. But finally, to get on to who is here today, our speakers, yes, you will unfortunately be hearing more from me. I will be talking and introducing about hydrogen. But we'll also be hearing from some better and bigger names. We have with us Rachel Nelems, who is the coordinator of the Global Gas and Oil Network's CCS working group at the global level. She'll be here to talk about CCS in general. We also have Rachel Kennerley from the Centre for International Environmental Law, or SEAL, who will be here to talk specifically about CCS and CDR, that's carbon direct removal in the EU. We're also very lucky to be joined by Martin Pigeon from Fern. He's a forest and climate campaigner with loads and loads of years of research working at Fern on these issues, and he'll be talking about bioenergy with CCS, or BECCS. And last but not least, we have Linda Schneider from the Heinrich Böll Foundation. She'll be here to tell us about geoengineering. So we've chosen these false solutions, not because they're the only ones, not because they're necessarily the biggest and most important at any one time, but right now they are the ones that we feel are the biggest threat to policy, good climate policy and real solutions. We'll also be doing a webinar on offsetting and carbon markets and similar things. So look out for that. Without further ado then, I'm going to get on and I am going to start by talking about hydrogen. There's no particular order to these presentations, except of course that the CCS and CDI in the EU goes after CCS in general.
The idea here is that it's like kind of a world cafe where you're going to be introduced to all these different issues and get a kind of broad overview. So I will start by talking about hydrogen. I'm going to assume very little knowledge on behalf of everyone here, so don't feel patronized if you know loads and loads about it. I've tried to kind of aim this at a broad audience. And I've called this gold at the end of the rainbow because, of course, I am going to talk about the rainbow of colors that hydrogen and ammonia offers, and I'll get onto that. Just to explain what this slide is showing here, we put out a report in OCI last year called Bubble Burst, Why Norway's Blue Hydrogen Fantasy is Over Before It Started. I highly recommend you read that. It's absolutely captivating reading, if I do say so myself, but it also includes a lot of the information and links to things that I'm going to talk about in that presentation that we're doing here today. So let's talk about hydrogen. What is hydrogen? I'm going to start with a rainbow because that's what we hear the most about. When you're hearing now about using hydrogen in the kind of move towards a greener economy, we talk about this rainbow. And the rainbow applies also to derivatives of hydrogen like ammonia that are also very, very important. So grey hydrogen, that's hydrogen produced from gas without CCS. But the ones you probably hear most about are these two here: blue hydrogen, or blue ammonia, which is produced from gas with CCS, or green hydrogen, which is produced via electrolysis. So they use electrolysis to split hydrogen and oxygen atoms in water, and the electricity comes from renewables. There are, of course, other colours of hydrogen and ammonia that you will hear about, and every now and again, every few months, there's a new hype about a new colour. White hydrogen is the new big hype. That is naturally occurring hydrogen found underground. You also have pink hydrogen, which is from nuclear power. Turquoise hydrogen, which is made using methane pyrolysis, which I am not going to even attempt to explain, but it produces solid carbon instead of CO2. Ad infinitum, ad nauseum, every few months there's going to be more hype about hydrogen. Why is this hype happening? What is it that hydrogen does? What do we need hydrogen for? But let's make a key distinction first. When we're talking about using hydrogen in climate policy, there are two different uses, broadly speaking. Hydrogen as energy versus hydrogen as a feedstock or hydrogen as a material application. So what do we mean by that? Hydrogen as energy is using hydrogen to fuel different processes through fuel cells or heat engines. And I think we have to be very, very clear here, as the previous slide suggested, that hydrogen is an energy carrier, not an energy source. It requires other forms of energy to produce it, whether that's gas, coal, or renewables through electrolysis, or any other of the funky colours that are there. Of course, white hydrogen, if it exists naturally underground, won't need energy necessarily to produce it, but we don't know how much of that is there and available. So I think it was somebody from GSCC, the Global Strategic Communications Council, that came up with this quote. So please forgive me if that's not the case, but it's best to think of hydrogen as an inefficient battery. It's a carrier of energy, but it's an extremely inefficient one because you have to use large amounts of energy to produce it. And it has very poor volumetric energy. That means basically to carry the same amount of energy as hydrogen as you would of gas or LNG or something else, it usually requires a lot more space, or if you're transporting it by ship or something like that, a lot more trips to carry it. Hydrogen as energy is proposed in a lot of different sectors. I remember very, very keenly 25 years ago in the UK, we were talking about loads and loads of hydrogen cars coming online. They never did. But the main sectors now where using hydrogen as energy is proposed is long distance road, sea and air transport. That's because batteries are considered not good enough or not having enough capacity, at least yet. Industrial heating, heating buildings, which is increasingly being discredited, and in more kind of direct fossil fuel related uses, such as hydrogen ready gas power plants, or ammonia co-firing. Ammonia co-firing is using ammonia alongside something like coal in a traditional coal power plant. So you reduce the amount of coal by a certain amount by using ammonia instead. Hydrogen-ready gas power plants are a genuine threat in Europe. We've seen that in Germany, we've seen that elsewhere. I'll talk a little bit more about that going forward, but there's this idea that a lot of gas infrastructure can be built because it can operate on gas for a few years, and then a few years later, it can be turned over to hydrogen as energy.
I'll come back to some of the shortfalls of this in a second. The next, though, is to talk about hydrogen as a feedstock. Oh, sorry, that's 2 slides of the same information. Very, very sorry for that.
Hydrogen as feedstock is where you use hydrogen to produce, process, or refine end products or derivatives. That includes ammonia, which is, of course, used in lots of different things, including fertilizer. And that's the main use of hydrogen today, not as energy, but as a feedstock into industrial processes. And as I've already hinted, the main sectors there are agriculture, refining of fossil fuels, chemicals, iron and steel. And it would also apply to things like producing margarine using hydrogenation, kind of thing. So it's used in food and beverages as well. A lot of different uses, and that is the main use of hydrogen today. Most of the hydrogen uses are in refining and fertilizers. Why is this important to know? Well, because hydrogen is becoming less relevant, at least in terms of hydrogen as energy, because we're seeing that hydrogen as energy is a very, very inefficient way to move away from fossil fuels. If you look at transport, batteries have come way further in the last few years, to the point where they have reduced many of the proposed needs for hydrogen, or the proposed use cases where hydrogen would be needed. We also have the more fundamental point that shipping and air transport have to be reduced. You can't really, you can't expect hydrogen or ammonia to replace all the fuel that's needed for long-term shipping and air transport. We have to reduce those. We can't get around it. So the use case there for hydrogen and ammonia has been reduced. In heating, we're seeing a similar thing where heat pumps are far more efficient and safer, and they are really taking off all over Europe. There have been unsuccessful trials of hydrogen heating in the UK and in other countries that have all shown it's just too inefficient, it's too unsafe, it's too expensive. In industry, there's technology and development that can meet 99% of industrial heating needs with electricity, and there are also alternatives to hydrogen for steel and cement. Another proposed use of hydrogen is in storage. So you would essentially create energy during a windy period with wind power, or during a sunny period with solar power, convert it to hydrogen as a kind of form of storage, and then come and use the energy again later. There are many good reasons why hydrogen could be used like that, but of course, it's a very, very inefficient way to do it. It's a very expensive way. You have to have somewhere to store the hydrogen. And hydrogen is very volatile, can be very unsafe, as I'll come back to. There are better solutions like using pumped hydropower that can very, very easily be explored. So again, hydrogen looks like a bad solution in that case. And when it comes to fertilizers, yes, ammonia you need to produce chemical fertilizers, but the EU, for example, has a goal on, I think, 20% reduction in chemical fertilizer use by 2030. Because of the issues around using fertilizers that are many. I don't have the time to go into them in this webinar, but use of chemical fertilizers has to be reduced, both for climate and nature reasons. And the reason why hydrogen is becoming less relevant in all of these cases is because of how expensive, inefficient, and dangerous this is. Transporting hydrogen, particularly over long distances, requires very, very, very high pressure, tight tolerances in whatever you use, whether it's pipelines or ships. Hydrogen is very, very, very volatile. Hydrogen is, of course, the smallest molecule in the universe. It leaks very, very easily, and it can be very, very dangerous. And it's also the case that you can't just convert gas infrastructure to hydrogen. That's usually the mantra of the gas industry when they push hydrogen. So as I said earlier, you've had the example in Germany of proposing hydrogen-ready power plants. We also see across Europe this thing of building LNG terminals, so supposedly hydrogen ready. And there's no real hard, fast definition of what hydrogen ready is. There's just this kind of assumption that the distribution networks, the pipelines, the ships can just be converted to hydrogen. And that's not the case. Hydrogen is, as I've said, has a lot lower volumetric energy. It's a lot more difficult to transport over distances. It leaks far more easily than natural gas. So you need to convert that infrastructure to hydrogen. That's often very, very expensive and doesn't completely reduce the dangers. So that's one of the many reasons why hydrogen in heating networks has been such a failure, because it's very, very expensive to do all of that. What we're also seeing is there's this danger of neo-colonial projects. And what I mean by that is we're seeing that countries in the global south are
being targeted or purported as places that can produce large amounts of hydrogen for countries in the global north and for Europe. An example of this is some projects we're seeing in Namibia, which was then slated to essentially export hydrogen to Germany to meet Germany's very, very high, or at least previously very, very high hydrogen targets. The problem with that, of course, is then if it's green hydrogen, you're using huge amounts of renewable resources that are needed in Namibia and in countries in the south to produce a very, very inefficient energy carrier for people in the global north. And there's a huge number of problems with these projects that, again, I don't have the time to go into, but we're increasingly seeing this kind of neo-colonial dynamic coming into hydrogen. And the issue there is that we're seeing a lot of hype of hydrogen without really actually assessing whether its demand is needed. This is the obligatory slide in every presentation you'll ever see about hydrogen, which is the hydrogen ladder. This was a kind of tool that was produced by Michael Liebrich to show all of the different potential uses of hydrogen, which are genuinely unavoidable, which are not. And as you can see, there's only a few uses of hydrogen that have no real alternative. And for the vast majority here, electricity and batteries is a better alternative than hydrogen. So what we really need to see is, instead of having a huge debate about producing as much hydrogen as possible and using it in every different case, what we need really is a debate about how much hydrogen do we actually need, and is that a better use of our time and resources than electrification of renewables. Instead, what we see is this kind of hype leading the charge of hydrogen. Who cares? Why does it matter that hydrogen's being hyped? It's cool technology. Many people will say it's better than fossil fuels, and there's enough bad stuff for us to go after. Well, what happens when the hydrogen bubble inevitably bursts, as it's now doing across Europe? As the kind of fundamental issues that I've pointed out of hydrogen revealed and costs and other obstacles persist, countries weaken their support for green hydrogen made from renewables and fall back on blue hydrogen made from gas or CCS. When blue hydrogen also inevitably doesn't materialize because of the underlying weaknesses of hydrogen and CCS, which compound each other, countries then often fall back on gas, given the, in theory, existence of infrastructure for gas. And this is being used to justify more gas exploration and extraction. And I'll give you an example here, which is Norway and Germany. The push for hydrogen constantly coming back to a push for gas and against structural change. In 2023, Norway and Germany signed a joint agreement on large-scale hydrogen export from Norway to Germany. The idea was it would be blue hydrogen in a transitional period, then green hydrogen, and they'd build a pipeline between Norway and Germany. Equinor, Norway's state oil company, signed agreements with Arver Air and SEFE, which are German power producers for hydrogen-ready gas power plants. Shell and Arkir, which is a Norwegian oil and gas company, also had blue hydrogen plants in Norway. What we've seen at the end of last year was that Equinor, Arkir, and Shell cancelled all their projects within 1 week in September 2024, and the pipeline work was ended. And what Shell said at the time is very telling. The market for blue hydrogen isn't there, nor is there any sign that a market is on its way to maturing. Green hydrogen is clearly prioritized. What happened is that basically blue hydrogen was running out of time. Blue hydrogen is very, very expensive. It takes a long time to build. It's vulnerable to both gas prices and the problems with CCS, which Rachel will go into later. Under the European emissions trading system, there'll be very few allowances left after 2040 for emissions. So there'll be no space for blue hydrogen with high residual emissions. And as a lot of analysts like Bloomberg NEF are saying, green hydrogen is getting cheaper all the time. It's likely to be cheaper than blue hydrogen into the 2030s. So there's a very, very small window in which blue hydrogen would make any sense, and that window is already closing. And what we're also seeing in Europe is, in general, the hydrogen bubble is bursting. There's been a lot of criticism of Germany in particular's hyping of hydrogen from Fatih Birol and the IEA. A very, very damning report from the EU Court of Auditors came in 2024 summer, saying that the targets for hydrogen were driven by political will, not robust analysis. And a lot of future hydrogen targets are based on basically assuming that fossil fuels will continue, shipping and aviation will continue in their current scale, and just kind of replacing fossil fuels with hydrogen straightforwardly, and fertilizers, all of which actually has to be reduced. And a lot of the current uses of hydrogen are in refining of fossil fuels, which we have to phase out anyway. And as well as the fact that CCS, as both Rachels are going to show us, doesn't really work, hydrogen itself is an indirect greenhouse gas, which is very prone to do it, can worsen the global warming effects of things like methane and short-lived gases.
So there's no room at all for Norwegian hydrogen export. Blue hydrogen has been used nonetheless to push for more gas exploration in the Arctic.
Last year, some Norwegian politicians visited the German parliament and claimed that German politicians were getting down on their knees and begging the Norwegians to explore for more gas for blue hydrogen.
But in our report, we looked at the numbers, and what this graph shows is that
the amount of gas, not just in existing Norwegian fields, that is any further exploration, the gas not under contracts, long-term contracts in existing fields, were and always were enough to produce the amounts of blue hydrogen North Shell and Arca were thinking of producing. And of course, they've ended up cancelling those projects anyway. So it was a very, very thinly veiled attempt to use blue hydrogen to push for more gas. And what we've seen in Germany, you've got a new government now that is rolling back its hydrogen targets and simply going back to gas. These hydrogen-ready power plants are now, hydrogen-ready gas power plants are now basically just going to be gas power plants. So exactly as I said before,
hydrogen fails, gas is the fallback option. There's also no excess renewable capacity in Norway for producing green hydrogen in the kind of amounts that would be
necessary for export to any other countries. So,
in conclusion, politicians are making very unrealistic targets for hydrogen, and we're going to see they're doing the same thing for CCS.
That is to avoid making the more difficult structural changes that challenge the entrenched interests of the oil and gas industry. They rely on a lack of awareness that is pushed by oil and gas industry propaganda, because it's the oil and gas industry that's pushing hydrogen hype. And of course, that we're all desperate for some climate wins. We'd rather have
maybe some green hydrogen than nothing at all. The problem with that is that hydrogen in particular is being sold as a replacement for existing gas infrastructure, and when it fails, politicians just go back to gas.
And as with other false solutions, we, the public, have to take on the risks of this. We're the ones that are essentially funding the hype for hydrogen by giving out huge numbers of subsidies to oil and gas companies to push hydrogen, while the inevitable failure of these policies is used particularly by the far right to undermine all and every climate policy. So, for example, in Norway and Germany, it's been very much the far right that has said, look, hydrogen's failed. This is just another example of a expensive, unrealistic climate policy. Let's roll back the climate agenda and go for fossil fuels. For oil and gas companies, the risks are minimal. They potentially get a new revenue scheme, and in the worst case scenario, they get subsidies and good PR, while delaying phase out and deflecting criticism by looking like they're doing greener stuff by pushing hydrogen. And in conclusion, the push for hydrogen is constantly coming back to the push for fossil fuels and against the structural changes that would reduce the need to hydrogen, which is a very, very inefficient, expensive, and dangerous fuel, to an absolute minimum. That is what I had to say about hydrogen. Thank you all for listening. I'll take any questions if there are any questions now. I see there have been a few questions in the chat that are already answered. If anybody has any direct questions that they want to type into the chat, please do so. I just want to point out as well that the UK is also pushing, in particular, blue hydrogen, a little bit of green hydrogen, but a lot of blue hydrogen as well. I've not included it here because this is more of a kind of EU focused webinar, despite having talked about Norway a lot as well. They are very much the kind of examples of what I've been talking about here today. The Guardian and DSMOG did an investigative report last week, which many of you will have seen, where minutes from a meeting between Equinor and the Chancellor, the finance minister of the UK, Rachel Reeves, revealed that Rachel Reeves literally described their agreement as a quid pro quo, where higher oil and gas taxes were essentially compensated by handing out very large subsidies to Equinor, to the Italian energy company, and others who are involved in the blue hydrogen projects in the UK. So we're seeing exactly the same dynamics. Seeing a few questions here. Do you have an opinion of hydrogen use in e-fuels and sustainable aviation fuels? From Florence Long. Yes, and as I was saying, this is one of the areas where hydrogen is still very relevant because you don't really have a sufficient alternative in terms of batteries or electrification for the kind of long-term aviation or indeed often for short-term aviation. But it keeps coming back to the thing of we can't fly as much as we do currently. Certainly on the same scale, because the amount of hydrogen we would have to produce the e-fuels and so-called sustainable aviation fuels or other similar alternatives would be massive. The renewable energy required to produce that through green hydrogen would be enormous and would take renewable energy away from better uses. So again, nothing in principle against more sustainable alternatives, but ultimately, we can't just fix these with a technical fix. We are going to have to structurally address air travel and reduce it. Another question here, how would you ensure openness to applications for hydrogen that actually makes sense and differentiate it from areas where it's a dangerous distraction? That's a very, very good question.
I think the simplest way is to actually reverse the way that the analysis has currently been done.
The discourse on hydrogen has been very much just let's produce as much hydrogen as possible. And this has been driven particularly by Germany. They've said to Norway, give us green hydrogen. They've said to countries in North Africa, give us green hydrogen. They've said to Namibia, give us green hydrogen. And they're clearly hoping that one or several of these things will work out and they'll just have loads of hydrogen. I reverse this process and say, actually start with analysis of how much hydrogen do we really need, given how expensive it is, given how dangerous it is, given the fact that it's often linked to the gas industry in particular. And I think if you did that and you had that kind of approach, you would want to keep hydrogen use to an absolute minimum, and wherever it was produced, produce it as green hydrogen and only use additional resources, whether they're renewable energy, water, or so forth, to produce it. That would reduce hydrogen to a very, very, very small amount, and then we could have a kind of sane debate about where do we actually need to use hydrogen. Unfortunately, the way the debate has been so far has just been to hype it up, and then when that hype inevitably bursts, you just go back to gas. So I think that's the way we would be able to kind of differentiate between the uses. What about the huge quantities of green H2 needed for SAF? Yeah, I think I've addressed that. Green hydrogen is an extremely resource-intensive process in terms of energy. I saw once a statistic that if you're going to use green hydrogen to decarbonize steel globally, you would need as much renewable energy as the entire electricity usage of the EU. We just don't have that kind of additional renewable capacity lying about. We need to decarbonize transport, we need to decarbonize the power generation, heating, and so forth. We need renewable energy for that. So then to waste renewable energy on massive amounts of green hydrogen is very, very inefficient. It also risks those neo-colonial projects that I was talking about. And by the way, the neo-colonial projects aren't just between the traditional North and South. What we've seen in Norway is that a lot of new renewable projects are put on the indigenous Sami people's land, causing human rights violations, and those people don't see any benefit from the energy, of course. So that's a very good point, that huge quantities of renewables are needed to produce relatively small quantities of green hydrogen. And that's before you come to any kind of leaks along the way from pipelines or ships or anything like that. So it's a very, very inefficient way to produce energy. So we should reduce it to an absolute minimum to avoid all of these side effects. How is it possible that T&E did not discover this? I don't necessarily understand the premise of the question. T&E is Transport and Environment. For those of you who don't know, they've been doing a lot of work on full solutions. I don't know their exact position on hydrogen. Look, a lot of organizations are favorable to hydrogen. We do need probably some in certain uses, but again, I think T&E and many other organizations, including the organizations here, would agree on the principle that renewable energy should be used to decarbonize everything where it can be. Electrification is the best way, and hydrogen should be kept to an absolute minimum. So there's a lot of great work going on this. OCI aren't the only people working on this by any means. There are lots of organizations working on this, and if you're more interested, then please do contact the organizations you're working with, and I'm sure they'll have very interesting things to say. That's
hydrogen done. everything you'll ever need to know about hydrogen. If you do think of questions during the rest of the presentations, please ask them in the chat anyway, and I'll try and answer them in writing. Let's go on to our next presenter. There's been way too much ALID in your screens and in your ears for the last half an hour. Let's get one of the Rachels. Let's get the first Rachel Nelems. Rachel, as I've said, is the coordinator of the Global Gas and Oil Network, or GEGON CCS working group. She knows everything about CCS in general, and that's what she's going to now impart to us. So Rachel, over to you.
Thanks, Alid. I absolutely do not know everything there is to know about carbon capture and storage. It is an ongoing journey for all, but I do know enough to know that CCS is BS, which is what I will hopefully be able to convince you of in my little intervention here. So as Alid said, I am Rachel Nelems. I work with GON or GEGON, coordinating a global working group of folks looking at carbon capture and storage. This is a resource hub that we have put together for members of the working group and allies. So if anyone is interested in having this as a resource, I'm really happy to share you on it if you send me an email afterwards. But basically, I will use it to sort of just give you a little bit of the picture on CCS and kind of go through it a little bit. So basically, carbon capture and storage is the idea of capturing carbon at the site of a fossil fuel burning project, trapping said carbon and injecting it underground with the endeavor or attempt to then reduce emissions. But as we have seen, it is prohibitively expensive, proven to fail, and has actually never advanced. Carbon capture and storage was first invented as an idea about 50 years ago for the purpose of enhanced oil recovery, which is the process of capturing carbon, injecting it underground in order to into an oil reserve, in order to extract more oil, in order to burn more oil, increasing emissions. This is a process that has been done over those 50 years, but long-term storage seems at this point completely unviable, and they have been trying to make it work. Over $83 billion has been invested. I would say that's very much at least on what we know of, but the amount of carbon that's been stored is negligible. And I think just to give folks a little bit of a picture, I think even the most data-minded people can find the difference between millions and billions a little bit hard to picture. So I find visualizing it is helpful. So this is a little Canva graphic that I've designed. So this top line is how much carbon capacity there has been achieved after 50 years. So this is around 50 million tons. I think very notable in this number is the fact that around 80% to 85% of the carbon that is captured currently is used for enhanced oil recovery. So it's injected in order to extract more oil. So it is actually not able to be counted as long-term storage. The second line here is according to the IEA, and this is if all current global CCS projects go forward and are able to be completely successful by 2030. So this is 675 million tons. This is a big if, because we've seen that there has been virtual complete stagnation on almost every front on CCS, and about at least 80% of projects fail to move forward due to various technical and financial issues. But even amongst that, it would be difficult to know how much would be redirected towards enhanced oil recovery. Yeah. But then this third line is the kind of interesting one, which is the yearly global carbon emissions for 2024. And I don't know if anyone knows the number off the top of their head, but it is pretty big. It's 41.6 billion tons of carbon. And it actually went up by 4 billion between 2023 and 2024. So as we can see, the scale of the problem is not only like scratched by any of these attempts, it is growing by far more than any of this has any claim to be able to address. So I think after hitting you with those numbers, I'm going to show you this little video, which I think gives a little bit of a colorful explanation.
CCS has missed every single target we've set for it. Let's take a look. 20 years ago, we told you that by today, CCS would capture 5,000 million tonnes of CO2 per year. Today, the world can barely capture 10, which is so far off target you can't even see it on this graph. And when you remember that our global emissions are 36 billion tonnes each year, even if it had met its target, it would contribute approximately fuck all. We also said there'd be 100 CCS projects running by today. Today, there are only 6, but the biggest one's right here in Australia. So how's it been doing? Well, we gave Chevron $60 million to capture its emissions, and in 2016 it captured fuck all. In 2017, fuck all. In 2018, fuck all. But in 2019 it finally got clogged up by sand. To date, Gorgon has captured only 30% of its target, and that's just its processing emissions. If you include all those released when the gas is finally burned, it captured barely 2%. But hey, Chevron stored 100% of that 60 million you gave them. Capture and storage. And that's just the latest fail.
Here at the Canadian government, we spent about $1 billion to prove CCS works at this power plant, except it proved it doesn't by failing to reach its target every single year. And here at the US government, we said this one would give us clean coal. It was years late, billions over budget, and then gave up because it cleaned jack shit, as did this one.
And it's not just the technology that sucks, the economics do too. Because CCS is so expensive that even if it worked, which it doesn't, implementing it would be unprofitable for our mates. Unless, of course, we make you pay for it, which is exactly what we...
So on that cliffhanger, hopefully that was enough to entice you into the world of how juicy, but also messed up CCS is. So just to sort of emphasize some of those points, the truth about CCS is it's not just unproven, it's been tried for over 50 years and it has been proven to fail time and time and time again, and it's not advancing. So an Oxford report found that there had, looking at 40 years of CCS, that there was no evidence ever found of technological learnings or cost reductions in any part of the CCS project. A flagship project in the UK called Teesside. Researchers found that after accounting for upstream emissions, that project was increasing emissions. And thanks to ALID sending a very recent think tank report forecasting CCS, it actually found that failure rates were increasing. So progress is actually going backwards. It is insanely expensive. The difference between just a high CCS pathway and a low CCS pathway would cost world governments $30 trillion more. And I think what's really important to sort of paint the picture of here is that this is delaying a fossil fuel phase out, and the purpose of all of this is to justify the continuing of burning of fossil fuels by, the 404 page. I'll have to share it. I'll have to share you on it. So if you send me an email afterwards, I can share it with you. So the continuing of burning of fossil fuels is the purpose of CCS. There were researchers that found that it would extend oil production by at least 84 years. Another reason driving all of this is that this is the play of the fossil fuel industry to be able to continue profiting. So there was actually a House Oversight Committee report that had documents with fossil fuel companies admitting on the record that this was being used for increased usage of US fossil fuel resources and to continue burning fossil fuels through the transition and beyond. So I think as we consider that this is something that is being pushed at such a wide scale, I think it's important to imagine who benefits from this sort of thought experiment, the idea that we can sort of just continue things exactly as they are and just kind of crunch the numbers and reduce and extract and delete and throw away some of that damage. I think in terms of the EU, I think the other Rachel will get into more of the sort of policy details. But just to give you a bit of a picture of the scale, this is a report by IEFA and Andrew Reid from last year in October, looking at the EU's current CCS plans, and found that they would cost as much as 520 billion euros, and would require at least 140 billion in government funding. And to give a comparison, to help us put those numbers into perspective, the EU's entire expenditure for 2022 was around 170 billion on everything. And that would capture, their current plans would capture, if successful, which is a big if, about 13% of just 2022's emissions. And when I attended a workshop on the CCS directive, there were many fossil fuel companies there who were asking questions like why, you know, with the premise of getting public money to support the CCS investments and developments, why they would be wanting to know about storage if their plan was to do enhanced oil recovery. And I think lastly to say that it is not just an innocuous attempt to just experiment because we need to try everything. This is shows signs of being extremely dangerous, and there have been pipeline leaks of CO2 that have led to mass poisoning events, leaving victims permanently injured. And I think as we see that the EU's CCS plans include 17,000 kilometers of carbon pipelines to be connected all across Europe, that will leave quite a lot of people exposed to pretty horrifying effects of potential carbon leaking. And so there is a page on here that explains a little bit of what happened in the United States with a CO2 pipeline leak. And with that, I will end it there. I will drop my email in the chat, so if you would like to have access to that resource, we can share that. And if you're interested in knowing more about how to take part in the resistance against CCS, definitely reach out.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that very comprehensive introduction. There's been a few questions in the chat. I've put your email in the chat, so, or rather the Q&A for anyone who needs it. It's rachel@ggon.org. The website
is currently thought of as kind of like an internal resource for you know, people interested in this issue, which is why it's not public. So you need to be given access to it for now, and it's still in development. So if you have questions or suggestions, you can come with them. We've got some time for more questions about CCS. I don't currently see any in the Q&A, so I will ask a question, Rachel. You know, I get a lot of, I live in Norway, so I get a lot of pro-CCS input in my life that I could do without. But one of them is that, okay, it's expensive, but everything costs money. Are you against spending money on climate policy? Is it really just the price that will determine it? Why is it that the costs of CCS are such a problem, but the costs of, say, offshore wind or batteries are less of a problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think just the scale of the amount of money that is suddenly just sort of coming to be found for CCS really outpaces the investments that seem to be willing for not just you know, renewables, but also for the global south and its transition, and also for, you know, the basic necessities of everyday people. I think we see in the UK they're planning to invest 22 billion pounds when, you know, they're having very real challenges for, you know, working and lower class everyday people. So I think we have to look pretty closely at why so much money is just readily available for this, because I think we can see quite clearly who continues to benefit, and that's people with power. I think maybe one thing I would also add to this is this DSMOG article, which talks about the EU, some of the pieces of the EU's CCS plans and its targets, and found that there would need to be 651 successful projects by 2040 in order to reach its current plans. And currently there is only CCS happening in Iceland and Norway, and it's to the tune of, I think, a little over 2 million tons, which again, if we think back to that graph, it's like really virtually absolutely nothing, particularly if part of that is going to be returned into enhanced oil recovery. So I think we need to be really keeping a close eye on whether that money is even going towards capturing carbon, even if it could work, or if it is really for the purpose of extracting more oil in order for fossil fuel companies to continue to profit.
Thank you for that. There's a question in the chat. Denmark, the poster boy of EU climate policy, is promoting CCS heavily from national funds, expecting further EU funds later. Why is there no criticism? What happened there?
I don't specifically know this situation in Denmark, but I can imagine maybe it's somewhat similar to Norway, where I think there's kind of this like bubble of conversation where, I mean, I think the case in Norway, Alid would be able to speak more succinctly on. But, you know, I think Norway does benefit from being able to continue to sort of be able to export its oil and gas capacities. And I think we're seeing, yeah, just a pretty strong grip on the narrative. And I think a lot of that is held by, in the case of Norway, Equinor, and Equinor is actually influencing the narrative globally. So not even just in the Nordics, but everywhere they seem to be able to just emerge and sort of suggest that it's a good thing. And I think just because they're a national oil company does not mean that they're not operating in the interest of profit. But I don't know if you have anything to add on that, Alid.
Well, look, the main use of CCS in the North Sea countries has been two things.
Either to indirectly allow politicians to look like they're going to meet their climate targets in the future. They can set a target for long into the future and say, well, CCS and CDR will save us. And by the time CCS and CCR doesn't save us, those politicians will be long gone. That's the first thing. And then the more direct thing is, of course, to promote and sustain fossil fuels. And what you've seen in Denmark is, you know, they have actually gone pretty far in trying to phase out oil and gas. They've set a date for that. But the transition is, of course, extremely hard. There's a lot of resistance. So having something like CCS that you can say, look, it will be the new industrial savior for us. They're like any country. Denmark has very specific areas that are dependent on oil and gas. So you want to be able to sell to the trade unions. You want to be able to sell to the people who live there that CCS can bring new jobs. There's kind of always a kind of direct case being made there, and that's what we're seeing across Europe. The phrase job washing has been introduced for CCS. So again, without going into great detail about Denmark, we're seeing the same dynamics.
Yes, and as Martin has said, NOAA, which is Friends of the Earth Denmark, are very, very critical of the plans. They've done a lot of work also on gas pipelines, CCS, that kind of thing. So do check out their work. Thank you very much, Rachel N, for your contribution. Again, if you have more questions for her, stick them in the chat. We will now go on to talk about CCS and CDR in Europe, in the EU, in a little bit more detail, and that's with Rachel Kennerley. Rachel is a campaigner at the Centre for International Environmental Law. She focuses on the EU and CDR and CCS. So there's literally not a single person on the planet better placed to give this presentation. Except for the fact that Rachel K is on a train and therefore has some issues with joining us here, but she has been so kind as to record her contribution, I believe. So Tiziano, if you can set that up, we'll listen to Rachel.
Hello, my name's Rachel Kennerley. I'm the International Carbon Capture Campaigner at the Centre for International Environmental Law, and I'm here to talk about carbon capture and storage and carbon dioxide removal in EU policy. I'm going to cover hopefully very quick introduction to CCS, CCU and CDR, just to give us a bit of context for them in EU policy. Then I'm going to talk about kind of the EU carbon capture ambitions and plans, kind of what are the plans, what scale of things are we talking about here, and then look at the specific bits of EU policy and legislation coming up where we can find the support for these technologies. So first up, a very brief run through of CCS, CCU and CDR and what they are. So carbon capture and storage, first up, is where carbon capture and storage aims to capture carbon dioxide from industrial outputs, kind of at the source of the emissions. So it aims to capture emissions before they leave the factory or the plant. It's then processed, usually pressurized, is transported via pipeline, truck or ships, again, often under pressure. There might be some temporary storage somewhere along the way as well. And then it is injected either via pipeline or loaded onto ships and taken out to injection sites and injected into the bedrock underneath the seabed or into depleted oil and gas wells. That's all offshore storage. There is onshore storage in Europe as well, but most of it, as we'll see later, is offshore. So I've primarily focused on that. And then once it's injected, it's meant to stay there for millions of years. And there are big doubts about whether that will happen. There are risks and significant limitations at every stage of this process with CCS. It's generally, in fact, been proven to fail as a technology over the decades it's existed, and it acts as a distraction from ending fossil fuel use, of course. Carbon capture and utilization is something that we're hearing more and more about, and it's similar to carbon capture and storage, but instead of the captured carbon being injected into the bedrock, it's taken to other industries and it's used in products like in producing plastics or building materials or chemicals. In addition to the fundamental problems with CCS, CCU is only ever temporary because this CO2 is released on relatively short timescales as those products are used and decay. So it's meaningless as climate action. Carbon capture and utilization should not be used as climate action. The third category of things I wanted to talk about was technological carbon dioxide removal. So carbon dioxide removal involves taking carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere or from the biosphere, and it's then stored either via CCS or CCU or other methods like being taken up by the soil or settling onto the ocean floor. There are natural forms of CDR, like restoring forests, but the more concerning ones are the technological CDR approaches. They might also be called engineered CDR or novel CDR or geoengineering. And this category includes things like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage that you'll be hearing about some elsewhere in this webinar, direct air capture where emissions are pulled directly from the air, and processes to alter the ocean or the soils to encourage them to take up more carbon dioxide. These are all unproven at scale, they come with huge risks, and they allow for the continuation of fossil fuel production and use rather than focusing on ending fossil fuel production use. I'm sure you'll hear more about the problems and fundamental flaws of lots of different false solutions across this webinar. But from now on, I'll focus on the why and how the European Union and some of its member states are promoting CCS and CCU and CDR and supporting them with billions of euros of public money. Of course, one of the main appeals is that these technologies allow this narrative change away from ending fossil fuel use to managing our emissions. So we can continue with the fossil economy as we know it and continue using fossil fuels, but with these technologies to kind of come in afterwards and clean up the emissions afterwards. These technologies are a lifeline for polluting industries and essentially allow them to keep on polluting. Essentially, it's business as usual. Just to on the scale and the extent of the fossil economy and where these technologies exist, sometimes we can fall into the trap of thinking carbon emissions are mainly coming from burning fossil fuels for energy, but the fossil economy is much wider than that and includes things like the manufacturing of plastics and fertilizers and chemicals, incineration as well, and of course transport. And CCS and CDR are being used to justify the continuation of all of these sectors and the emissions from all of these sectors. So what are the ambitions and plans of the EU around these technologies and around carbon capture? So a lot of the plans are covered in the EU's industrial carbon management strategy. This covers CCS, CCU, CDR, and actually CO2 transport infrastructure as well. And it sets out some EU aims, for example, by 2030 to have capacity to store 50 million tonnes of CO2 annually, raising that to 280 million tonnes of CO2 per year by 2040. And in the post-2040 period, that CO2 is actually a major market commodity, so it's traded around Europe, and that the EU achieves emission neutrality by 2050, and after that becomes net negative with emissions. So that's really relying on carbon dioxide removals to bring emissions into negative levels. At this point, I just want to point out as well how wild that ambition is. So far globally, only 52 million tonnes of CO2 has ever been stored globally. So the EU aiming to achieve that each year within the next 5 years is wild. And I think really highlights how much of this approach is a fantasy, that it cannot happen. Despite this, there's a huge amount of money and effort being funneled into support for CCS, and IEFA research actually found that Europe's current project pipeline could cost up to 140 billion euros in public money. This kind of real buy-in to carbon management, managing carbon emissions rather than stopping fossil fuel use, really started in the previous administration as part of the Green New Deal, but it's been really supercharged this term with the Clean Industrial Deal, with the competitiveness agenda, and with several bits of upcoming legislation, which will further boost CCS, CCU, and CDR, which we will talk about later. But first, I wanted to just show you a little bit about what this could look like in Europe. So EU plans for CCS alone would require a huge build-up of pipelines, industrial clusters, because it requires a different setup of industries than what we currently have. It would require injection sites. If we go down the bioenergy with carbon capture and storage route, those projects could transform land use in Europe and around the world, because lots of it would happen outside of Europe. More CO2 transport means more trucks and more ships as well. So there are lots of impacts on the infrastructure side. So this is an example of what the CCS network could look like under one of the scenarios the EU has explored. This might not be the scenario that plays out, but I think it's a good example of what CCS build-out may look like. This is the potential transport and storage network for 2030. So you can see storage is mainly concentrated in the North Sea, it's mainly offshore, but there are transport routes moving carbon dioxide up from southern Europe, from industrial clusters on the other side of the continent. And this network length is about 6,500 kilometres and crosses 18 countries. If we look at the 2050 map, this is the same scenario. The CO2 network extends across 22 countries in this map. It's around 15,000 kilometres. The North Sea is still the main storage site, but there are other storage sites kind of popping up around Europe as well. So it is a bit more distributed. So looking at these kind of upcoming bits of policy and legislation, because there are quite a few of them that are coming to kind of build this support, this political and financial support for these technologies. First up, we've got two that actually already happened. So we had the competitiveness compass in January this year, and this set out the new administration's direction and aim to boost economic growth, and it solidifies the push for EU competitiveness with the USA and China, and that was suggested to be done by boosting industry and simplifying regulation and requirements for businesses. And it really set up this prioritization of businesses over environment or health. We also, earlier this year in February, had the Clean Industrial Deal come out, and that focuses on high emitting industries like steel and chemicals, providing them with cheaper energy and support to decarbonise by boosting clean technologies. Now, the Clean Industrial Deal is filled with kind of wording around clean technologies, which sounds really nice. And there are some good things under clean technologies like renewables, but it's also things like CCS, CDR, blue hydrogen, and a variety of other false solutions. So whenever clean technologies is used, it is often hiding technofixes that allow for business as usual rather than moving away from fossil fuels. The Clean Industrial Deal also announced changes to regulation and frameworks to make it easier to access financing for clean technologies to be developed, and this includes CCS and CDR, and that's financing as well as kind of things like guarantees as well. So coming up very soon is the EU climate law amendment. That's expected to be announced by the European Commission next week on the 2nd. And this will include a new 2040 climate target. That's expected to be put at 90% of 1990 levels. However, the Commission is intending to allow flexibilities in how countries meet this target. And that target's already the minimum of the recommended range, right? So they've gone for the minimum and then they're adding flexibilities in on top of that. We don't know exactly what these flexibilities will be, but the two that we expect are that some of that 90% of reductions will be allowed to be met using international offsets, and that could include CDR offsets, and that CDR credits would be allowed into the EU emissions trading scheme. Both of these measures would strengthen the hold of false solutions like CDR in EU policy. They'd undermine real climate action, and they will prolong the use of fossil fuels in the EU. If that sounds like a bad idea, the Real Zero Europe has a sign-on statement addressing these issues. Please do go sign by this Friday, the 27th. There's a shortened link there, although I'm sure somebody might be kind enough to put it in the chat as well. But yeah, please do consider signing that. Another piece of ongoing policy is the carbon removal certification framework. So this is a regulatory framework to facilitate the creation, certification, and use of high quality carbon removal, and this is part of a potential kind of prerequisite for carbon trading system, which would allow removals to be used to contribute to member states' climate targets, including under the Paris Agreement. The methodologies presented so far include really low standards, lower than other certification frameworks, including like the one under the Paris Agreement and the one that guides voluntary carbon markets, which are both flawed already and are not good enough, and these standards come in even lower than those. And in fact, in some areas, the standards are lower than were used in the Clean Development Mechanism, which was a previous mechanism that the EU actually banned from being used in the ETS because it was such low quality. So we're really looking at some very problematic kind of proposals in this area. Now, the use of removal credits is fundamentally flawed anyway. They shouldn't be being used as a form of climate action, but these weak guidelines risk credits being used to claim emissions reductions when the vast majority of these credits will not represent any reduction. So it really is a perversion of the idea of climate action. Next up, I just wanted to quickly mention two pieces of chemicals legislation that are coming as well on the 8th of July, so coming up pretty soon. The chemicals industry is not only highly toxic, but also produces a lot of emissions, both from burning fossil fuels, but also from using fossil fuels as feedstocks to create plastics, fertilizers, etc. New chemicals policy is expected to encourage the use of clean technologies, as well as the use of captured carbon as a feedstock in carbon capture and utilization in chemical production. So we know this is only kind of temporary storage, it isn't climate action, but this will kind of, a lot of those technologies will be used or they might show up in this chemicals legislation as well. Finally, I will just mention the Industrial Decarbonisation Accelerator Act, which is a proper mouthful. This aims to help energy intensive industries decarbonise while maintaining their competitiveness. And it aims to do this by speeding up permitting, facilitating investment, and creating markets for so-called low carbon products, i.e. those that are made with things like CCS or CDR or blue hydrogen, etc. There is actually a call for evidence for the Industrial Decarbonisation Accelerator Act that's open at the moment. It closes on the 8th of July, so if anybody wants to have a look at that, I will put the link in the slides notes so people can access it there. And we expect this act sometime towards the end of 2025. So just to wrap up, as you can see, the EU is going full out to support fossil solutions like CCS and CDR, among many others. It's supporting them politically and financially, creating markets for CCS and CDR products, and encouraging the use of offsets and removal credits as well, really building them into the foundations of how climate action is taken in EU member states. Unfortunately, there seems to be not a lot of resistance to these fossil solutions. So it's really important that we focus on demands on explicitly ending the use and production of fossil fuels rather than falling into this kind of managing emissions narrative, and ensure that we're calling out for solutions as what they are. That they're expensive, that they're dangerous, they're risky, they're unproven, or in many cases proven to fail, and generally they're dangerous distractions from real climate action and are just used to prolong the use of fossil fuels by granting pollution permits to polluters. Hopefully I'm around to answer some questions, but if not, I know others will be, or you're very welcome to get in touch via my email address. Thanks.
Thank you, past Rachel, for that presentation. Current and future Rachel Kennerley is with us on a train, so we will try to ask some questions and see if it works. There's a question in the chat that is as follows. Considering the clear IPCC language on the need for removals, natural and technical, and very importantly, as a complement, not substitute to emissions reductions, isn't it more accurate to focus on CDR as a potential dangerous and overhyped distraction rather than a full solution? Surely every ton we pull out the atmosphere is a good thing as long as it doesn't slow down emissions reductions. Rachel, are you able to give us your answer?
I can try. How is my audio?
I can hear you clearly.
Oh, wow, great. That's exciting. Yeah, thank you for this question. Yeah, obviously the rapid deep cuts as soon as possible, obviously the priority. And I think one of the major issues that we come up against with CTR and CCS solutions is this distraction element of what they do, right? How they were used politically, how they are used economically. There's a very big difference between what is, the ideals, the assumptions that are included in, for example, in the IPCC modelling about how these technologies may be used or can be used, and the reality that plays out, right? So I think there was a report from the DNV recently that really showed that most of the CCS growth, for example, that's currently happening is for fossil fuels, right? And I know in the UK, if you look at their committee projections, for example, still millions of pounds being spent, for example, and for biomass, so things that are directly making climate change worse. I think that IPCC reference is a really important one. The IPCC also in its reports is, it really emphasises that if we do overshoot 1.5 degrees, there's pathways that overshoot 1.5 degrees and rely on kind of bringing us back down under the emissions threshold later. They have irreversible impacts that we will not be able to kind of pull back from, and that will be devastating. So that emphasis on cutting emissions fairly and rapidly now is obviously the priority. The IPCC also finds there are huge physical uncertainties for doing large-scale carbon dioxide removal. The reliance on future CDR delays emissions cuts now, and the CDR technologies like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage and direct air capture with carbon capture and storage come with immense risks and harms for ecosystems. So I think this is, I think they are false solutions. I think they are dangerous distractions from what we need to be doing. And the focus must be solidly on ending fossil fuels and fossil fuel use, in the short term.
Thanks for that, Rachel. There is another question in the chat, which I think will allow you to answer in the chat itself, Rachel, because the audio isn't perfect. But I think we got the gist of that answer. I certainly did, at least. And thank you so much for joining us despite being on the train. I know that the British train system is neither particularly comfortable or renowned for its Wi-Fi. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for your presentation. As always, any more questions, please put them in the chat, and Rachel and the rest of us will try and endeavour to answer them there. Let's go on to our next topic and our next speaker. Our next speaker is Pigeon from Fern, who is going to talk about BECCS. among other things. So over to you, Martin. Thank you so much for being here.
Yes, good morning, everybody. Thanks, Aled, for the introduction. I've slightly broadened the scope of my presentation to BECCS and biochar, and you will quickly understand why. I wanted to first focus on what we are actually talking about today on the durable CDR voluntary market, because that exists. You can see that biomass-based CDR, that is carbon removal projects that work with carbon that is taken from biomass, that is biogenic carbon from the biosphere, are absolutely dominant on that market. We are talking about 99% of the deals so far in 25. It's not always that outrageous, but it's never much less, actually. But we're talking about deals. If you see on that slide the very large numbers there for BECCS, but you have to understand that these are promises in terms of what actually gets delivered today in terms of tons of carbon removed, at least on these markets, is biochar, essentially. More than 90% of biochar, and analysts are describing biochar as the only method today delivering at commercial scale. So when we are talking about CDR today, we are de facto talking about biochar for more than 90% of it. Now, echoing what's been said previously, we certainly do need to remove excess CO2 from the atmosphere. The problem is we need things that work. I'm not convinced, to put it mildly, that BECCS works, for example. I will try to describe briefly how BECCS functions and how it does not function. You can see that on the left, you have a simple description, a graphical description of what industry claims BECCS looks like, which is trees are capturing CO2 from the air, then we're burning these trees, generating energy, capturing the resulting CO2 from the tree's combustion, and we store that CO2 underground in a CCS project. The reality is very different. First of all, it takes a lot of time, and time is a very important parameter here for these trees to capture the carbon. When you're cutting trees, they stop, of course, capturing carbon because you're killing them. And so you have to include the foregone sequestration, like the sequestration that they would have performed had they not been killed for BECCS. When you're using biomass that's from agriculture, typically fertilizers are used, and these release greenhouse gases. The processing, the transport, the drying, the grinding, the pelleting of biomass to prepare the fuel, all of these processes generate CO2. And now we come to the actual combustion and capture and disposal process, because actually storage in that case is an abuse of language. There is no attempt even by the CCS industry to pretend that they would be able to recover the CO2 for one reason or another afterwards. What they are doing actually is disposing of the CO2 somewhere deep and hoping it stays there, because injection, we know how to do. The rest, it's much more hypothetical, but I won't spend too much time on that. So that's for BECCS. And you can see that to echo what Rachel was talking about, the EU is currently finalizing accounting rules to certify credits generated by projects using biomass and carbon capture and storage, BECCS. And they are this rounded rectangle here is the scope of what they're counting. And everything else outside the rounded rectangle, they're not counting. I've done a comparable graph with biochar, and you can see that it's a very comparable story. You can see that in one of the many graphics that you find actually on the internet of describing the production of biochar. I just took one, which was quite good. At least it was relatively exhaustive, describing how biochar is being processed. Biochar is essentially wood charcoal, if you're doing it with wood, but that's the ultra dominant feedstock used. The problem is that the whole production chain leaks CO2 at every step, including CO2 and other greenhouse gases, actually, like methane in the pyrolysis phase in the middle. And here again, the European Commission is designing an accounting methodology to assess the possible climate benefits of using biochar as a carbon removal technology. And they are essentially narrowing the scope of that methodology to a fraction of the biochar, which they deem resistant to degradation. Inertinite fraction is how they describe it. Biochar, when you between the biomass and the end result, biochar here, you're losing anywhere between 20 and 60% of the carbon that the biomass contained originally. And the inertinite fraction of the biochar can be, depending again on the feedstocks you use and the production processes, etc., can be anywhere between like 50 and more than 90%. But everything else you're losing. And the reason, to cut a long story short, the reason the European Commission is not counting all of that carbon in the supply chain is because it is biogenic carbon, and by convention under the Renewable Energy Directive, biogenic carbon is not counted in the energy sector, but in the LULUCF sector, in the land sector. I'll get back to this. So as a quick overview, when we're talking about durable CDR today, before the EU introduces any additional incentive to use them, be them, in the 2040 targets that are going to be revealed, at least proposed next Wednesday, or in the ETS review, for which there is an ongoing consultation, actually, and I encourage you to participate in it, to say that really the zero rating of bioenergy should end in the ETS, because it's just creating too many problems. But so, to recap, when we are talking about CDR today, that is carbon removals, the absolute overwhelming majority is not the fancy plants you have in mind, the direct air capture, but it's biomass-based. Most of it is biochar, the overwhelming majority. BECCS is an expensive promise at this scale, even though projects are going to be built, in particular in Sweden and Denmark. I will get back to this. But the assumptions for this to deliver negative emissions, that is carbon removal, are strong, and they're strict. It's very impressive. If you have a 90% capture rate, with a lot of very positive assumptions, like using only forgivable residues, like residues that would be that could not be used otherwise, etc., etc. You're still creating a carbon debt of like 3 to 4 years. That is, you're seeing a climate benefit only after 3 to 4 years. But that's assuming very, very favorable things, like a 90% capture rate that nobody ever actually achieved. If you use a much more realistic, I think, and still quite optimistic, in fact, 70% capture rate, the numbers completely collapse, and you are already not seeing any climate benefit before at least 20 years. And that's more or less the life expectancy of the installation itself. So will BECCS projects deliver any climate benefit at any point? Is an open question as far as I'm concerned. An interesting observation is that on this voluntary market so far, Microsoft pretty much bought everything. I mean, more than 75% of the credits. It's pretty much the activism of one company that's driving this whole sector. Yeah, DAX is really, really marginal, and the global south is again providing really most of the volumes of biochar because it is much cheaper to extract wood in these countries than in Europe. And yeah, you could have thought that we were beyond extracting the EU's needs from the south, but apparently it is not the case at all. Now, the little problem here is that in the EU, at least, most forests are already used and harvested for products and energy, and actually beyond what is already sustainable. And that is a really, really key point. I'll skip fast a bit on this one to spend a bit more time on this one. You have to understand that today, the European Union is losing its carbon sink. And one of the main drivers is the many incentives for bioenergy. On the bottom left here, you can see an evolution of the combustion emissions of biomass used for energy in the EU for the past 30 years, more or less, and you can see they've almost tripled. And on the top left, you can see that if these emissions were not counted as zero on the ETS in the energy sector, they would already represent more than 15% of the EU's total emissions. If this was an economy, it would be the second largest in the EU after Germany. We're not talking about anecdotal volumes here. We're talking about huge volumes. And this is having a direct impact on the land sink because, of course, the more biomass you remove from forest and other ecosystems, well, the less these ecosystems are able to sequester atmospheric carbon. And you can see that we've lost a lot of ground here. And that raises a whole question, which is, if you don't have a land sink, and we have countries in the EU who have lost their land sink already, such as Finland, the most forested country in the EU, Estonia, Germany, to name a few, are you still able to pretend that the biomass you're producing is renewable? I don't think so. In fact, there is a cross-compliance now between the Renewable Energy Directive and the LULUCF regulation, which is the one EU piece of legislation that regulates the land carbon sinks targets. Unfortunately, there is a big discrepancy essentially between the incentives to deploy renewable energy that are very strong and the incentives to conserve the land sink that are really weak. In fact, EU member states today are talking about weakening these targets for keeping the land sink. I'll get back to this. But what I want to, I mean, if there's one thing I would like you to remember today is this, is that when we're talking about biomass-based CDR today, most of what we are doing is to extract carbon from the land sink, not the atmosphere. We're cheating, essentially. I mean, I don't think that many of us in this webinar today voluntarily contribute to that. It's more something that's more happening at the policy level, and we only have so much control on that. But please keep in mind that since 150 years, the land sector, that is, all the carbon emissions that we do because we extract carbon from the land, from forest, for agriculture, etc., that represents almost 30% of the total emissions. It's more than oil. So you can absolutely wreck the climate just with mining ecosystems, and we've done it already. And so this pretends that because you're using biogenic carbon, it should be climate neutral is BS. It's really wrong. It's fundamentally false, and it's a really, really important point to keep in mind. I mean, the one thing removing carbon from the atmosphere at scale today is precisely ecosystems, and we are mining them now. I'll quickly end looking at a couple of projects on the BECCS and biochar front. The first one is the only existing one, actually, at scale. It's in the US. It's been running for about a bit more than 10 years now. But it's a very specific one. It doesn't claim to be carbon neutral. Actually, it's only capturing a bit more than 16% of all the CO2 that's emitted on the site. It's based on fermentation because it's essentially a corn to ethanol fermentation plant on which a CCS installation has been added. And they are sitting on top of a very favorable geological location, supposedly. It's a very deep, I think it's sandstone aquifer with a sort of thick layer on top that should be able to cap it, but they've observed leaks, and what's really problematic is that they've been caught covering it up. And essentially, it wouldn't exist without the permanent funding of the US Department of Energy. I'll skip this one because it's a fantasy, but and I hope it will never be built. But I'd like to spend a bit more time on the two last ones. This one is going to be built. The final investment decision has just happened by Stockholm Exergi, which is the Stockholm utility, essentially. It's the municipal company, except it's a public-private partnership with, it's 50-50. So it's just private enough that you don't have easy access to their information, actually. It's quite annoying. It's expected to launch in 2028. Considering what I told you earlier, it's an open question as to whether it will achieve climate benefits and when. Considering its known wood supply, because not all of it is known, and the uncertainties around its future capture rate. But while it does so, it will for sure burn millions of tons of wood. They're already burning 1 million tons of wood a year, actually, in the existing biomass plant. And they will burn hundreds of millions of euros in public and private capital, for sure. They are planning to inject their CO2 in Northern Lights, the CCS project in Norway under the North Sea, which is about to start, finally, after many years, which is currently at capacity. So there is a memorandum of understanding that's been signed, actually, between Northern Lights and Stockholm Exergi that Northern Lights is going to expand their capacity to be able to accommodate the 900,000 tons of CO2 Exergi plans to needs to inject, actually. As no, I haven't said that, but their economics rely on efficiency and capture rates that have not yet been met by a CCS installation anywhere in the power sector or any time. They know that the existing capture technology with amines doesn't work with biomass, actually, and that they will have to use another technology that they have developed with a pilot that they believe will work at scale with biomass combustion fumes. But it's a bit of a bet. This technology has never been tested at that scale, so we'll see. And with Swedish academics, we did a small calculation, which is a bit sobering, which is that to give you an idea of the scale also, and the money and the wastage of public money at stake here. If Sweden's if the logging pressure in Sweden was reduced by 0.8% in just 1 year, that would remove as much carbon dioxide from the air as what Stockholm Exergi is now promising to remove from forest in 10 years. And this would be achieved at a tiny fraction of the cost, because essentially what you would need is to pay forest owners to not log or to log less. And that would bring, of course, several co-benefits, because forests are much more than carbon with sticks. They are actually our life support system, very much. Last one, but not least, the largest...
Martin,
yeah. I need to close.
If you can close very quickly, that'd be great, and then we'll get to the question.
Yeah, sorry for spending too much time. So yeah, I will just leave you to read this, in fact, saying that the largest biochar project in the world at least is planning a forest monitoring system to track all biomass sourcing in real time, unlike what the EU member states are trying to do at the moment, which is to sabotage and destroy the forest monitoring law, without which there won't be a reliable, fraud-proof CRCF, ETS, bioeconomy, and 2040 targets. Now, who would benefit from that, you might wonder. I'll close here.
Thank you so much, Martin. That was fascinating, so much detail. And of course, all these slides will be shared after the webinar today, as well as the recording, so you'll be able to look at them in more detail.
We had one question, which was, is there no campaign build-up by major environmental justice groups to bring attention to this issue to the wider public?
Do you feel you can answer that, Martin?
Probably we don't qualify as major environmental justice groups then. We're doing our best, but by all means, spread the word. Of course, we need much more attention to these issues. We're talking about, fundamental cheating here, and at a very high cost, both in terms of public money, also private capital, actually, that could be used for genuine renewables, cleaner, for sure, for solar, wind, but also forests. And again, forests are our life support system. Let's not play Russian roulette with it, please.
Thank you very much, Martin. We don't have any further questions in the chat, and of course, we can have more time for questions at the end. So thank you for that, Martin. We'll move on to our final presenter, which is Linda Schneider from the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Germany. And she's going to tell us a little bit more about geoengineering. Thank you so much for being here, Linda, and away you go.
Thank you, Aled, and thank you to all the participants that are still in the room after so many presentations. Okay, so let's get into it. So geoengineering. First, just to give you a bit of a definition of what geoengineering is. Geoengineering is the intentional and large-scale manipulation of the Earth's systems, so the biosphere, the oceans, and the atmosphere, with the intention of counteracting or suppressing some of the symptoms of climate change, or at least that's the stated aim. But I guess the motivation behind could also be, explained differently for some of the actors involved in this. Geoengineering can be done on land, in the oceans, and in the atmosphere, and there are two fundamental categories, if you will. One is carbon dioxide removal, CDR, and the other is solar radiation management, SRM. So under this definition, actually some of the approaches and for solutions that we've already talked about also qualify as geoengineering. So because other speakers have covered this already, I won't go into the details of any of the land-based geoengineering, but I will come back to some of the terminology and contestation around the terminology of what is called geoengineering, what is not anymore called geoengineering. Okay, so next slide, please. So some of the stuff that is absolutely still called geoengineering is a series of techniques for solar radiation management or solar geoengineering. So two of those are stratospheric aerosol injection and marine cloud brightening. So these are attempts to basically block out incoming sunlight. For instance, in the case of stratospheric aerosol injection, by polluting the stratosphere with reflective particles that will block incoming sunlight, or by artificially manipulating marine clouds. So actually in the case of stratospheric aerosol injection, that will be done by huge fleets of aircrafts, not really by balloons. And in the case of marine cloud brightening, you would need huge fleets of ships actually to do that. And those interventions would inherently be planetary scale. And because they're planetary, they also, and this is particularly true for injecting particles into the stratosphere, they're inherently untestable, because you can do modeling, you can do computer modeling on what would happen, and actually there are a lot of simulations and modeling that's being done on these technologies, and they show different impacts. They could that's what the models say, disrupt weather patterns, circulation patterns in the stratosphere. They could lead to droughts and floods and different sorts of impacts across the world. And they're also as per the models, different regional winners and losers, but those are really just computer models. So, and because the whole thing is planetary scale, it's basically really impossible to test, because to know what the real world impact would be of such technology, you would have to go planetary scale, basically, and that's similar, kind of similar for marine cloud brightening. And also something that is not necessarily specific for these, but is very relevant here, is something called the termination shock, because what you do with these technologies really is just to mask the increase of temperature. So you're, reducing the incoming sunlight, but everything else basically remains the same, right? You're not reducing emissions, you're not reducing CO2 or GHG concentration in the atmosphere. So all you do is suppress temperature rise. And if for some reason you would stop this intervention at the planetary scale, you would get a rapid increase of temperature back to basically where it would have been without the intervention, but at a much faster rate, which is called the termination shock, and which would make it basically impossible for many ecosystems and species, and probably human societies as well, to adapt to that fast of a rate of climate change. So next slide, please. Another area of geoengineering is called so the two technologies that I just mentioned are kind of atmospheric geoengineering in a way, that they take place in the atmosphere. Although there's a bit, in the case of marine cloud brightening, it's a bit of an overlap with marine geoengineering as well. But there's another area of geoengineering which is called marine geoengineering. And in this case, it is about manipulating the chemistry or biology of the world's oceans at a really vast scale. And in this case, it can be with the intention of removing CO2 from the atmosphere. So it's either CDR or SRM. So in the case of, as I mentioned, marine cloud brightening, or the microbubbles here in sea foam, the idea would be to basically introduce reflective surfaces to the ocean surface. So it would reflect incoming sunlight, which obviously creates problems for all of the life underneath that surface. Yeah, but also those CDR technologies here, like ocean fertilization, which would involve dumping huge quantities of iron, for example, into the ocean, or alkaline materials to enhance the alkalinity of the ocean, so it would draw down more CO2, or actually something called direct ocean capture, which functions quite similarly to direct air capture. So it would mean processing huge quantities of water through facilities that would, strip out the CO2 and, return the dead water to the oceans. And then supposedly, because the CO2 content in that water is reduced, it will draw down CO2 from the atmosphere. At least that's the idea. But then you're still stuck with the problem of, what do you do with the CO2 that you captured? And then, because formerly it was stored quite, permanently in that ocean water. So it doesn't make much sense either. And the environmental impacts are really quite serious. Okay, next slide, please. So, I will, stay at this pretty much top line level. But of course, there are also a lot of materials where you can read up on all of the, technical details of these different technologies, and I'll show you some resources later. But some of the common problems with these geoengineering technologies are the fact that they constitute large-scale technological interventions in actually quite fragile ecosystems, and that's true for land ecosystems and ocean ecosystems. And in all of these cases, and that's similar to some of the problems we've heard in relation to BECCS and biochar and others, is that they add additional stress and pressure on land, on water, on the ecosystems, on people, and actually there are a number of known consequences and risks and impacts, but also a lot of unknown consequences, especially when it comes to, the planetary scale interventions that are proposed. Looking at those concepts and kind of drawing on real world experience that we have with, components of it, maybe, it's quite clear that there are severe risks and impacts associated with each of these technologies. And of course they vary, and it depends on, what's being done and what is involved, and kind of, if they require a lot of land or energy or water or fertilizers or other resources. But it's quite clear, especially at the massive scale that is needed for having, an impact on the world's climate, the scale of the impacts would also be, massive, basically also planetary scale. Because of all of the, the land and energy and biomass and so on, consumption that they involve, such approaches. And actually also if you spray particles in the stratosphere, there's a huge threat to human rights, to indigenous people's rights, to land rights, and a lot of other, just human rights. And as I mentioned before, at least in some of these cases, they're really quite untestable and also ungovernable. Because if you look at what the models already say in terms of, regional winners and losers of geoengineering, it's quite, hard to imagine a scenario under which, the international community would come together and decide who would be, at the receiving end of, a planetary technofix, basically. And it's quite clear, that only a couple of countries would have the actually military and economic capacity anyway to implement such a technology. And in the context of current kind of geopolitics and so on, it's I think it's easy to imagine in whose interest such technology would be developed and implemented if it ever was. Next slide, please. It is also a false solution because, as with all of the other false solutions, because it diverts attention away from the real and proven solutions to the climate crisis. And I think we do really see that in a number of different, spaces, where the attention really shifts from what we actually need to do, which is, reducing emissions to zero, to a focus on, stuff like carbon removals on land, in the oceans, or even, advancing research on some of the solar geoengineering technologies. A lot of this actually also is driven by carbon markets. That's particularly true for the marine CDR options currently, and generally profits. Also, if you look at who's kind of behind, some of the SRM research, I think overall it really is, all of this is an attempt to uphold a failed status quo, and that's, obviously in the interest of the fossil fuel industry and other polluting industries, but also the tech billionaires, which is actually where a lot of the funding for solar geoengineering is currently coming from. And finally, drawing on some of the points that I made earlier around who would, who has the power to take these decisions and who would benefit, who would suffer, who would, bear the burdens. I think it's quite clear that such technologies would exacerbate inequality and injustice, and also climate colonialism, in the sense that, land and energy and water and all of the other resources would be appropriated for certain, interests and industries to continue polluting. Next slide, please. Okay, just very briefly on governance, although governance is not to be understood necessarily as governance of implementation or anything, but just to mention that it's not a complete vacuum kind of at the international level, but there have been and there are discussions in a number of multilateral environmental fora that address this issue. So one is, that's kind of one of the key cornerstones is a moratorium under the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, which was first agreed in 2010. And it is on all climate-related geoengineering. So that actually includes all of the the BECCS and DACS and all of it, all of the land-based approaches as well. It was reaffirmed in 2016 and just very recently in 2024 at COP16 in Colombia. But interestingly, there is not necessarily much coherence between the different UN fora in this regard, because there are obviously other fora, like in the UNFCCC, Article 6, for example, that are where these approaches are being incorporated and implemented. Yeah, whereas the CBD has agreed on this moratorium and just reaffirmed it last year. So it definitely, it is there. Then also there's a convention called London Convention on London Protocol, which has a governance framework on marine geoengineering, which has already prohibited ocean fertilization already a while back because of the environmental impacts of the technology. There've been a number of outdoor experiments that really showed the environmental consequences, and they're also currently looking into more marine geoengineering technologies with the intention to regulate. And then finally, there are also other just legal obligations of states under international law, like human rights obligations, the precautionary principle, the obligation to prevent transboundary harm. So even in the absence of, a dedicated governance framework or treaty for all of geoengineering, there are of course international obligations that apply. And next slide, please. Yeah. So something that I just wanted to mention, maybe as a reflection at this point, is around terminology and kind of where we're at with these different approaches, because even though kind of by the definition and where we started many years ago, both CDR and SRM were part of were considered to be geoengineering, and I think there is a certain value in referring to it that way if you look at the actual if you look at the actual scale of what's being proposed, including for CDR. But I think it's important to note that CDR has become very normalized over the last couple of years, and in particular the land-based options, so BECCS and DACS, and we've heard from different speakers about CDR, for example, in the EU and in different, implementation at different levels. Also in the IPCC, it's become very normalized, including, that was mentioned in one of the questions, including in the scenarios. And actually in the IPCC, it is treated more as a form of mitigation these days. Sometimes it is differentiated, but it is referred to as mitigation in the IPCC, but they did used to use the term geoengineering actually also for CDR kind of many years back, but dropped the term at some point. So I think that is just important to note that there's been just this kind of process and dynamic going on around the different terminology, and of course, because geoengineering has, it's kind of a bad name and has a bad reputation, I think, in order for CDR to become more normalized, it had to be sort of taken out of this definition of geoengineering. Then marine CDR is, I would say, currently the new frontier. There's been a surge of outdoor experiments and projects, a lot of selling of carbon credits in this space. So it is very much driven by carbon markets as well. And also in the IPCC, it is currently one of the big, it was one of the big controversies at the most recent IPCC meeting, for example, there was one in China earlier this year. And there was a big fight over the inclusion of marine CDR options in the IPCC's methodology report. And there was no consensus that could be found on this. So this discussion, this controversy will have to continue at the next meeting. So I think this just shows how the marine CDR options are really kind of the next frontier. And then kind of behind that is solar geoengineering, which is kind of the ultimate technofix, if you will, which is still kind of largely theoretical in a way and conceptual. But actually, there are huge amounts of money flowing into this field, as I mentioned previously. A lot of it coming from philanthropy that is associated with the tech billionaires. And there are also international discussions on the governance of this and actually attempts to prevent the development of this technology in the first place, because it would actually only ever really add more chaos to a climate system that is already breaking down. So I think even though this is still feels very much, kind of on the horizon and very, out there, I do think it's important to take it seriously, because this technology is being developed and the research is being advanced, and it's important to, put a stop to it before it gets developed and is sort of existing in the world. So just to show you a couple of kind of resources or actors, networks that are working on it. So one is the Hands of Mother Earth Alliance, the Home Alliance, that HBF and a number of other groups that are in this webinar today are members of. So it's an international alliance against all forms of geoengineering that you're welcome to look up or join. And then just in relation to solar geoengineering, there's something very important, which is the call for a solar geoengineering non-use agreement, which is basically which will basically amount to a ban. So the idea is to really take it off the table, because sort of with under the assumption that we, even though we only have the models, we do think we know enough about the potentially catastrophic impacts of this technology that we should not develop it, actually, and not develop it first to see if we might ever need it, but instead we think that it would always just add chaos. Next slide, please. So this is just two more. If you want to read more about geoengineering, there's a website called Geoengineering Monitor, which has technology fact sheets, updates, like regular updates on developments in the field. It has background analysis of, political negotiations in different fora. And it also has a world map. So we're tracking geoengineering projects across the world. So there's a map, an interactive world map associated with the Geoengineering Monitor that is, trying to keep track with all of the geoengineering projects. Is that the last slide? I'm not sure. Is there another one? No. Okay, so I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda. That was fascinating. If there are any questions, please, again, put them in the Q&A. We've had one question that's not specifically geoengineering related, so any of the speakers can feel obliged to answer. I had a question, actually, Linda. Weirdly, I think geoengineering features very, very regularly in culture. It features in TV shows, a computer game I've been playing recently, set in the future. Basically, climate change is solved by geoengineering. Why? Why is that? It seems to feature so regularly. Do you think that's linked to some kind of fundamental assumption that people have that this is going to save us at some point, or what is that about? It just struck me while you were speaking.
Yeah, that's a good question, but I definitely think it's true. I do think it's. I mean, I agree. It's it features in a number of movies, right, and novels, actually. I mean, I think most of those are in the context of science fiction work, right? I mean, movies and novels. But I do think it's also to do with I don't know. I guess a sense of, I don't know, fatalism sometimes, and the fact that climate will break down and that this stuff will come at some point, because people claim it's the only thing we can still do, quote unquote. But again, I mean, in my opinion, I actually think this is also represented in some of those works of art, basically, is that even in those, that stuff goes wrong, right? Most of the time, it's not like it's actually saving anything, but it's actually quite a dystopian future envisioned that that is represented in these movies and novels.
That's right, yeah. I just think if there's anyone here in the chat who's a media studies or an English literature major and is looking for a PhD topic, I think that would be fascinating. I totally agree. Rachel?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to just come in on that question because I think it's a really important one. And I think it really just points to like a complete fundamental lack of imagination of a different kind of society. And we are just seeing like the proliferation of these tech hacks because that is the kind of sort of society that we live in, that is just disposable, that we can just throw these things away, that we can just fix it, we can just continue. And I think this really points to the scale of the challenge that we face. And I think with a lot of the technologies that Linda is presenting, I think for people who maybe do have a bit of imagination or think that, you know, we have some optimism for like a different society that we could build, some of this might seem quite far-fetched. But I think with the extent to which we've seen carbon capture be presented as a viable option, I think we need to be very on high alert that the fossil fuel industry and the proponents of these so-called solutions are able to just sort of convince us of anything. They could say red is blue and they would have the resources to convince people that that's the case. So I think really like lifting up the sort of warning that Linda made there as well, that we are going to be facing even more desperation to just continue things as they are. So it's really quite a challenge that we are up against.
Martin?
Yeah. Just to add on that line, I think it's quite obvious that none of these technologies are really about solving the climate crisis, but it's more about feeding, especially large states, strategy in strategic rivalry, and that's the problem we face as a movement with climate options. Is that climate is fine as long as it doesn't dent the power race. The second it starts doing that, then you're out of the picture. And we need to confront that. And this is why I think it is so important that the people working on climate issues also work on peace resolution issues, on social justice issues, because you cannot disentangle these things, actually. That's my interest. It's easy to say.
It is, but this is exactly why we wanted to do this webinar, bring together all the different fuel solutions, and that's actually quite a nice discussion to kind of tie it up now that we're at the end. And this is exactly why we have to see fuel solutions under one banner, I think, because they're all different technologies, they all have their similarities, they all have their divergences, but the analysis of Real Zero Europe, which I hope everybody here participating now understands a little better and hopefully agrees with, is that we should see these things as part of a whole in terms of essentially delaying structural change that we need for real climate action. Thank you so much to everybody who has stayed here for the last 2 hours. That's a lot of information you've received. And I know there are a lot of people in the Q&A asking, will you get the presentations? Yes, you will. We'll send those around with all of the links as well that were mentioned. Please do visit the Real Zero Europe website, check it out if it's interesting to you. Don't come away from this webinar with the impression that there's a huge army of people working on these issues. We don't have the resources, as Martin alluded to, that our opponents do. The complexity of these issues means that we're often chasing the latest announcement, the latest technology. In the last few days, I've had to learn more about onboard ship carbon capture, which is something I didn't know about a few days ago. There's always new things coming out. So if you have time, if your organization is interested, get in touch. We'd love to collaborate. I'd like to thank all of our speakers, Linda, Martin, both Rachels. Thank you so much for spending your time here with us. I'd like to also thank Tiziano Biaggi, who is here with us, who works for Real Zero Europe and is an absolutely amazing resource and person without which we couldn't do any of this work. So thank you so much, Tiziano, for making this webinar possible. And again, thank you to everybody who's participated. This is just the start of what we hope will be a series of webinars. If you have any feedback, I speaking for myself, but I'm sure all of you as well who've presented today, it's This is cutting edge stuff. This is new stuff. It's difficult to communicate. So if you have any feedback on what we said, please let us know. And yeah, keep in touch, keep up the good fight, and we'll see you hopefully again at one of these webinars. Thank you so much, and have a lovely rest of your Friday and a lovely weekend.